if, do you have any projections about that, what would happen? And then the second question is, how can we actually motivate and make people aware, particularly in this underdeveloped world, that they must recycle?
What will happen will be buried in waste.
Yes, that's what Mr. Opper was telling. If we do not take care of it, we are going to be buried in waste, and we are seeing excellent examples in third world countries. And third world countries, especially in Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand, they have become so conscious of the waste and air pollution that the government is actually stepping up the regulations, not only stepping up the regulation, but enforcing the regulations. Like when Queen Elizabeth some time back, the steamer, the ocean liner, was polluting the atmosphere before it entered the harbor of Singapore. Singapore government impounded the ship, and in spite of Britain or England protesting, they said unless the problem is rectified, we are not releasing the ship. And they succeeded, and the problem got rectified. So the government, all our administrators have to become conscious, just like that. If Singapore can do it, any one of our countries in South America can do it.
But what are the global mechanisms that we have to monitor and help bring along countries which are not engaged in this activity?
Yes, yesterday I saw a very interesting feature where even United Nations was thinking of placing an unknown or unreliable or untraceable tax on airline companies, ocean liners, and so on and so forth through the various member countries to support itself. So even they are thinking of making profit by people breaking the rules. But I think Mr. Opper will be discussing it later, that the ISO 14000 regulations are stringently going to be carried out purely for the survival of this earth, and that will be able to control globally the waste management.
Okay. We have another phone call now from Instituto Tecnológico de Celaya. Good morning. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. My question is the following. What treatment can you give to the biphenyl chlorinated that are not different from incineration, and another alternative?
Well, when you take biphenyls, especially polychloride, the most important thing that we know, it is a phenolic compound. Another thing that we already know, if ever we try to break it in any form, we are going to get other chlorinated compounds which can be far more dangerous than biphenyl, PCBs. Now we are seriously thinking of using PCBs and synthesizing them with other organic chemicals where they will not break down easily, especially in the electrical industries. They are now studying the procedure.
Thank you very much for your questions, and you'll have another opportunity after Module 2, which we would like to continue now, in which Mr. Opper will explain policy development and regulatory trends in the area of waste management, including the ISO 14000 standard.
As an environmental lawyer, I was asked to start my presentation by discussing current rules and regulations that govern the disposal of waste throughout the world. The difficulty with this task is that there are no such rules and regulations on an international scale. Apart from certain treaties or conventions, such as the Basel Convention, which is still pending ratification in several countries, including the United States, laws governing disposal of waste are very specific and unique to each individual country. Some countries, like Mexico or the United States, have fairly elaborate laws and regulatory schemes governing how waste should be handled. Other countries have very little in the way of legislation governing how waste should be handled. Aside from a few treaties or conventions, there are frankly few international agreements that consistently regulate the activities of industry on a worldwide scale. However, I've also been asked to talk about innovative approaches to handling waste, and that has led to this discussion, which focuses on a voluntary company-based policy, not a national or international law or regulation, that provides a tool to examine the environmental impacts of industrial activity within any particular organization, and provides a focused approach to deducing those environmental impacts. Chief among those impacts is the production of waste that comes about from industrial or manufacturing processes. Disposing of these wastes is an expensive and, in many countries, a highly regulated activity, as it should be, given the significant impacts that waste can have when it enters the environment. If a company shifts its focus to reducing those waste streams, it can often find ways to reduce its costs and at the same time reduce its negative environmental impacts. This is the innovative theme behind ISO 14000. Sponsored by the International Organization for Standardization, which you've already discussed in the October 5th video conference that addressed the ISO 9000 series of international standards, this movement addresses reducing pollution, reducing the waste stream, and creating a common international standard for companies and countries around the world. From the legal point of view, the ISO standards provide a unique evolution in what might be called international environmental policy. Just as countries have tended to approach environmental regulation from the perspective of a command and control environment when regulating activities within their own borders, so also has international law and policy evolved from the execution of treaties that primarily regulate the activities of member countries. When we talk about international environmental law or policy, we usually mean those treaties, such as the Basel Convention, which regulates the disposal of hazardous wastes in different parts of the world and requires nations who are signatory to the convention to adopt laws governing the activities of people and companies within their borders. The ISO approach is fundamentally different. Instead of a command and control approach to regulation, it is a set of voluntary standards that depends on member companies, not countries, perceiving that the adoption of these standards is in their own best economic interest. In essence, it relies on market forces for implementation rather than the command of any government. Like ISO 9000, ISO 14000 focuses on the process by which quality management or environmental management systems are implemented and is not focused on any particular industry or technology. Both sets of standards are voluntary, and both will likely succeed because of the perception by the users that these standard practices represent advantageous business practices and not simply a new set of demands that must be complied with. In this presentation, we'll briefly review the substance of the ISO 14000 series guidelines. Then we'll talk about some of the controversial issues that have accompanied the development of these standards. At their heart, however, is the theme that sound environmental management will result in an ever-diminishing waste stream with reduced volumes, reduced toxicity, and a clearer understanding throughout the business organization of how consideration of environmental impacts at all stages of production benefits the company, its employees, and the environment. Let's take a quick stroll through the ISO 14000 guidance document to get a sense of how it accomplishes these goals. The ISO 14000 guideline builds on work that's been done in other countries. The work began with the development of the British standard 7750. That standard was the first to address how to implement an environmental management system. This became the predecessor for the European Union standard referred to as the Eco-Management and Audit Scheme, which is called EMAS. EMAS was the standard adopted in the European Union to address the need for environmental management systems and is generally credited with having led to the creation of the Technical Committee 207, which is a group within ISO charged with developing a global environmental management standard in 1993. This committee took as its charter the goal of creating a common approach to environmental management that would be similar to the process that was generally followed with the ISO 9000 series on quality management. It was hoped that the adoption of international standards would facilitate international trade, remove potential trade barriers, while enhancing an organization's ability to measure performance and document improvements in environmental performance. Understanding environmental management systems and how they can be implemented in your company is therefore the key issue within the 14000 guideline. The guideline itself states that it is designed to provide assistance on implementing or improving these environmental management systems, consistent with the notion of sustainable development that was such an important piece of the United Nations Conference on the Environment in Rio and resulted in the adoption of Agenda 21. As the guidelines define it, an environmental management system provides order and consistency for organizational efforts to address environmental concerns through the allocation of resources, assignment of responsibilities, and ongoing evaluation of practices, procedures, and processes. One of the themes underlying the implementation of an environmental management system is, just as was true with ISO 9000, the concept of continual improvement and monitoring of procedures. The ISO 14000 guidance document is a general guideline. It describes the EMS, or Environmental Management System. It starts by analyzing the critical need for environmental policy to be adopted and embraced by management of the company or institution. This is, in fact, the first principle of the guidance document. Organizations should begin by adopting policies to address issues of obvious benefit, for example, ensuring regulatory compliance, or by making more efficient use of valuable resources and materials. It is critical to ensure success that the environmental management system obtains commitment from the top management of the organization. If the organization is not committed to embracing this concept, it will not succeed. In order to assess the appropriate environmental policy, an initial environmental review is required. A company should undertake a self-evaluation to determine what kinds of environmental impacts it currently has, the liability that may be associated with those impacts, the company's ability to conform with the laws of its host country, as well as policies and procedures dealing with procurement and contracting with others. These steps can lead to the development of a policy that will establish an overall sense of direction for the organization. The policy sets goals against which later actions will be judged. You should ask yourself whether your organization has an environmental policy. Does the policy reflect the values and guiding principles of your organization? Has the policy not only been approved by a board of directors, but are there people within the organization whose job it is to ensure that the policy is followed? Does the policy support continual improvement? These are some of the questions you will ask when entering into the exercise of developing an environmental management system within your organization. Once there is a plan to implement an environmental policy, the guidance document, which contains practical help on developing such plans, should be drafted. All aspects of a company's activities lend themselves to examination to determine what kind of environmental impacts are associated with the activity. The guidance document gives us a logical approach to this undertaking. First, we select which company activity must be examined. The guidance document gives us an example of how to evaluate environmental impacts from the product design phase of a company's activities throughout. Next, you identify whether that phase of a company's activities has any environmental impacts. A little thought makes it readily apparent that concerns about product packaging, raw materials used in making a product, and the energy demands for product manufacturing are critical environmental impacts related to the design of a company's product. Having identified the product and what its potential impacts are, you then have to evaluate the significance of those impacts by looking at their scale, their severity, the probability that they'll occur, and whether or not those impacts are permanent or temporary. Then we contrast that analysis with a business analysis, evaluating how difficult it might be to change these environmental impacts, the cost of changing the impacts, the effect of the change on other activities in the company, and the concerns that may have been expressed by people outside of the company. A careful and methodical step-by-step review of all the company's activities will reveal a host of places where environmental concerns can be accommodated within common business practices. It is a discipline of going through the company's activities and identifying these environmental concerns that the ISO 14000 will impose on a member company. This analysis will lead to the development of an environmental plan that can address concerns within any particular company. The ISO 14000 document doesn't give you the plan, but it gives you the methodology and procedures for inventing a plan for yourself. The next critical step in the ISO procedure calls for the implementation of the plan. The implementation of plans can have a very different impact on large institutions as opposed to small or medium-sized institutions. The ISO principle is that plans should be appropriate to the particular organization and can be implemented in phases or stages as the level of awareness of requirements, expectations, and benefits evolves within the company or institution. The ISO process forces companies to determine what kind of resources are necessary to implement plans and make realistic projections for the financial, technical, or human needs necessary to make a plan work. This is perhaps one of the greatest strengths of the ISO process. It lends itself easily to implementation in a multicultural environment because of the inherent flexibility of the procedure. Rather than providing that any given plan shall be implemented by a particular industry, the ISO process leads to the development of plans specific to an industry, a country, or a corporate culture. In fact, the implementation of an identical plan might be very different from one country to another. The flexibility inherent to the ISO process provides that implementation of a plan must be tailored to fit the workforce and the corporate or institutional goals and culture. The successful implementation of an EMS will require thinking through how the plan is communicated to employees. Should everyone be gathered together in an auditorium to hear the president speak? Or should informal work groups be assembled at different levels of the production activity for a more effective understanding of the concepts? Written materials describing the EMS can themselves be very different for different cultures and different workforces. Should the materials be designed around illustrations or diagrams? Should the materials be detailed with indexes and references to other corporate policies? The answers to these questions must be made on a case-by-case basis as each company evaluates how to effectively communicate with its own employees, its customers, and the public. The next critical step of the ISO EMS process is the measurement and evaluation of success or mistakes. A company must find a method to quantify the impacts that adoption of an environmental management system will make on its overall processes. These impacts must be measured and monitored in order that the company can learn about which policies are successful and which activities require corrective action and improvement. ISO naturally requires that there be appropriate processes in place to ensure that data is reliable, such as regular calibration of instruments, test equipment, as well as sampling of software and hardware. It is essential to the ISO 14000 process that environmental performance indicators be monitored on an ongoing basis. These indicators must be objective, verifiable, and reproducible. Most importantly, they should be relevant to the particular activities of the organization, consistent with its environmental policy, practical, cost-effective, and technologically feasible. This results in better understanding of what action needs to be taken as management reviews reports about the results of monitoring and evaluation. This completes the cycle of the ISO Guideline 14000. It starts with the development of corporate commitment as evidenced by a policy, planning to implement that policy in a way that will address the need for legal requirements as well as environmental impacts, the implementation of the policy itself done in a manner suitable for the institution's workforce and goals, along with a process to monitor, evaluate, and report on results in order that the entire cycle can be constantly adjusted for continuous incremental improvements. This, then, is the outline of what ISO 14000 proposes for companies who voluntarily agree to register under the program. Now, there are several committees that are working on various elements of what will become the ISO 14000 series. We've just discussed the environmental management systems proposals that are being promulgated by TC 207, or Technical Committee 207. This systemic approach to environmental management will be supported by the work of other subcommittees. In addition to the general guidance found in the 14,000 guideline, there are two documents, ISO 14010 and ISO 14011, that will provide more detailed guidance on evaluation and auditing tools. ISO 14010 will be concerned with general principles of environmental auditing, while 14011 will discuss auditing of environmental management systems, as described in the earlier guidance document. The performance evaluation criteria call for an inventory of a facility's environmental impacts and identifying what indicators exist to monitor and measure improvements. This element obviously involves quantitative and qualitative factors as well. For example, evaluating how well a management system works is itself a qualitative judgment. The environmental auditing guideline, however, is almost entirely quantitative. This calls for periodic data gathering to determine the facility's environmental management success. An auditor doesn't make subjective evaluations of performance in this exercise, but notes quantitative results and reports those results to management. In addition to the work of the subcommittee on performance evaluation and auditing, ISO subcommittees are also addressing some product-oriented support tools, such as guidance on environmental labeling, which has become very important in the European Union, and life cycle analysis. Australia chairs Subcommittee 3 on labeling. The work of this subcommittee will clearly have a significant impact on how companies design and market products. It should be understood that this subcommittee is not just focused on labeling, but is trying to address standards for environmental claims of any sort. For example, some types of labeling attempts to analyze all of a product's attributes and communicate through some sort of sign or symbol that a product is environmentally friendly. These signs and symbols will be unavailable to companies not in the ISO regime. The guidance document will also address labeling in the sense of assertions by manufacturers about environmental matters, such as the product being recyclable. Consumers will know what is meant by the term when used by an ISO registrant. Lastly, there is a type of labeling being examined which might be compared to an environmental version of nutrition labeling, where ISO standards will be developed for labels that list the environmental impacts associated with any particular product. There has been significant debate over what the appropriate purpose of the labeling initiative should be. Given the significance of labeling issues to marketing and the positioning of products in the world marketplace, this has become a very controversial issue. It is clear, for example, that while improving environmental performance may be the possible outcome of some labeling, it's not the objective of all environmental labeling. Some labeling guidelines are simply designed to communicate information to consumers. These are issues that have not yet been resolved. Another controversial subcommittee is assessing the guideline for life cycle assessment. France and Germany currently share the leadership position on Subcommittee 5, addressing this issue. This could be one of the areas in which the ISO's environmental standard setting initiative could have the most impact on business. The concept, which most of us have heard, is that companies should take the environmental attributes of the entire life cycle of a product into account, from raw materials acquisition to ultimate disposal of the product. Life cycle assessment involves inventorying all of the environmental effects associated with raw materials acquisition, manufacture, use, and disposition of the product and waste stream from the manufacturing process, and evaluating the relative significance of all those impacts. It is already being used in a regulatory context in the European Union, and the US EPA is considering the use of life cycle assessment in Administrator Browner's Common Sense Initiative. The ISO guidance document does not itself require that life cycle assessments, or LCAs, be conducted, but this could easily appear in a regulatory context as different governments become attracted to the concept. It's a major challenge to develop a life cycle assessment methodology that is both technically correct and environmentally relevant. The application of this methodology to the business world, or the institutional framework in which products are created, provides another area for disagreement and controversy. We all expect that the ISO Lifecycle Assessment standard will be a powerful force for the integration of environmental issues into the operations of the company. And this alone will likely result in the creation of vast quantities of impact information about different industrial operations. How this environmental information is used and the essential cause and effect of conclusions that one might draw from this information remain essentially controversial issues. In addition, there is a subcommittee chaired by Norway that is addressing terms and definitions in an effort to ensure a common understanding of different technical and environmental standards. This work was necessary in order that the other subcommittees could have a coherent vocabulary that will ensure the terms used in one document are consistent with the way the same term is used in other guidance documents. This work, reflecting as it does the very heritage of the ISO effort, seems to have proceeded with relatively little controversy. Clearly, to the extent that adoption of uniform procedures worldwide reduces trade barriers and encourages free trade, it should be welcomed. As the integration of environmental issues into regular business practices evolves, we expect that the result will be pollution prevention, and that less waste will have to be managed and disposed of because less waste and less toxic waste will be the result of informed industrial planning and procedures. There is an advantage to the global focus that this provides a company, in that the ISO 14000 standards may well become this decade's next requirement for doing business around the world. We expect that with the attention being paid to reducing waste and increasing the efficiency by which raw materials are used, that profitability will increase for the companies that are adopting this approach. It certainly helps in distinguishing the company or institution as being committed to the long-term survivability of what we call the spaceship Earth. There may be commercial advantages to distinguishing your institution or company as being committed to these principles, and the labeling guidelines may offer you an opportunity to attract customer segments to your particular product because of your own commitment to these principles. Are there any danger signals that an institution should be aware of as the 14,000 guidelines are developed? Absolutely. First, we should all appreciate that the driving force behind ISO 14000 is the preoccupation with trade on a global scale. Are the European nations who are currently driving the different subcommittees completely disinterested in the outcome of their work? I think not. Some of the delegations to the work groups have been straightforward about expressing their goal of creating competitive advantages through the positions taken in the work groups. Just as with the adoption of ISO 9000, its introduction and extensive use in Europe was perceived by many outside of the European Union as a trade barrier, prohibiting their entry into this marketplace. This perception, however, did drive a number of countries and a large number of companies to meet the challenge head-on by adopting the 9000 series for their own quality control procedures. There's a concern, though, that the complexity and severity of some of the ISO standards will make compliance even more difficult for facilities located in countries that are still struggling with industrialization. As ISO registration becomes a requirement of doing international business, this could create a disadvantage for facilities located in countries that are not yet able to embrace the concept of an environmental management system. There are voices on the technical committee that speak out about the need for flexibility so that small businesses or businesses located in lesser developed areas can still embrace these management systems. The fear that these systems will be too complex to implement, however, is still very real. On the global level, there's a question about the relationship between the ISO initiative and the recently signed Uruguay round of the GATT. The new GATT contains provisions regarding technical barriers to trade, which provide for a preference for international standards over national or regional standards. We don't yet have a clear understanding as to whether these technical barriers to trade apply to non-product or process-related standards, such as the environmental management systems of ISO 14000. This issue was very important when a recent dispute before the GATT, caused by the United States laws regarding tuna fishing, resulted in a finding that the tuna law was a barrier to trade because of its focus on production or process methods. It is still unclear as to how the ISO standards may be accepted by the new World Trade Organization. In addition to these concerns about whether or not ISO 14000 will really reduce trade barriers, there are also concerns about whether or not it can really bridge the gap between the industrialized world and lesser developed countries, just as much as there are concerns about whether or not smaller business enterprises can adopt these rules with the same degree of flexibility that a large corporate entity might be able to do. In addition, there are concerns that ISO is calling for standards that may precede the state of the art. Like the debate on NAFTA, however, many of these concerns really reflect the attitudes of the listener. Just as the old question asks whether or not you see the glass of water as half full or half empty, when both are obviously true, so also should one ask oneself if reluctance to embrace the ISO 14000 process is really just a reflection of attitudes that must change if the institution is to survive in the global marketplace. These changing attitudes have already begun to show some acceptance in traditional government regulatory agencies. In the United States, for example, the U.S. EPA initially embraced the notion of voluntary business compliance to reduce pollution and reduce the waste stream when Administrator William Riley introduced the plan that he called the 30/50 program. This was a program in which corporations voluntarily agreed to reduce emissions and waste streams by 30% under certain circumstances. The effort proved to be a general success in that many large, forward-thinking corporations did voluntarily agree to implement programs designed to reduce waste streams. Unfortunately, the program didn't really provide a guideline for companies to accomplish the goal as much as it provided an incentive for companies to make the attempt. EPA Administrator Browner, in the current administration, also supports this notion of voluntary participation in waste reduction and pollution prevention programs. We earlier discussed briefly a series of steps that's been called Browner's common sense initiatives. These are incremental programs all designed to create incentives and rewards to companies that voluntarily reduce pollution by starting at the front end of their manufacturing processes. These initiatives are not limited to the United States. The trend has also shown up in Latin America. Semarnap, the Mexican environmental agency, has recently adopted a program of voluntary environmental auditing with the same goal of pollution prevention in mind. The trend is plainly visible and on the march southward. ISO 14000 represents a global effort by many companies that builds on this marketplace-driven trend. In conclusion, I'd like to leave you with a couple of thoughts about ISO 14000. First, it seems clear that these standards will eventually govern doing business everywhere around the globe. Just as ISO 9000 has become a requirement for vendors worldwide, it can be expected that the ISO 14000 standards will follow a similar evolution. These standards will clearly affect all of the aspects of current business operations, from the initial design of a product through the acquisition of raw materials to the disposal of finished products and their packaging. These guidelines are intended to cover the entire life of product development within a company, forcing the company to acknowledge and understand the environmental impacts of that process. In addition, these standards will likely become domestic benchmarks. We have seen countries adopt the ISO 9000 standards as their own, and we can expect countries to react similarly to the ISO 14000 standards. This may provide protection for a company that can show its own government how carefully it's monitoring and assessing environmental impacts. Or the standards could be used against a company by a government which could charge the company with either having failed to implement the standard or failed to monitor and take corrective action when needed. Lastly, you can still impact the adoption of the ISO documents. The ISO 14000 guidelines are still in development. A delegation from the United States, reacting to some of the issues in the draft standards, has had a significant impact on how the final standards will look. If your country is a member of the ISO, you can and should have input into this process through your own delegation. Individual companies and countries can have a substantial impact on what lies ahead if they take the time and effort to be heard. The future is never without risk, because as systems and goals change, those that can adapt and survive in new environments will succeed, while those who cannot may find themselves left behind. Don't let your organization become an environmental dinosaur. Embrace these opportunities to address environmental management and help ensure that there is a clean future for everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Opper. We're ready now to begin our second question and answer session. And to begin, we have a fax from Fundação Vanzolini in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And the question is, for both of you gentlemen, do you believe that the ISO 14000 standards will have the same level of acceptance as the ISO 9000 series?
Well, I think it's the case that the world expects that the 14000 series will have the same acceptance. We are all looking very closely at environmental performance, environmental management systems, and I think there's little doubt that this is going to spread to be a worldwide phenomenon.
I was at the Pacific Basin Countries Conference on Waste Management only about a month ago in Canada, and we had a little over 120 countries represented there,